At 81 years old, Diana Ross finally speaks of the one story she spent her entire life refusing to name. A story that began with a trembling 9-year-old boy in Detroit and followed her like a quiet shadow through every triumph, every heartbreak, and every standing ovation. For decades, she let the world believe their bond was simple: a mentor and her prodigy, a superstar guiding a shy young talent. But the truth, the real truth, lived in the space between what was said and what was never dared to be spoken aloud. It lived in sidelong glances on dimly lit sound stages, in the silence Michael Jackson carried whenever her name passed across his heart, and in the irrevocable trust he later sealed into his will. Before the world crowned him the king of pop, he had already crowned her something far more intimate: his first love, his greatest comfort, and the only person who could disarm the loneliness that fame carved into him. Diana saw it, she felt it, she carried it, and yet she held it at arm's length, terrified that one wrong step could shatter the fragile devotion of a man who lived between genius and vulnerability. Michael never blamed her. He simply kept loving her in ways that shaped his art, his choices, and the private corners of his life the public never saw. Now, as age softens her voice and time strips away the last layers of glamour, Diana Ross chooses to open the door to the past she guarded so fiercely. This is not a confession of scandal, nor a revelation meant to shock. It is the quiet unraveling of a bond that survived age, distance, marriages, fame, destruction, and death. A bond that both freed and haunted them until the very end. The story begins long before the headlines, long before the genius, the moonwalk, or the diamond-studded chaos of global fame. It begins in 1968, inside a Motown gathering filled with sharp suits, perfume thick as velvet, and conversations carried by people who believed they were witnessing the future of American music. In the corner of that glamorous room stood a boy so small he seemed almost swallowed by the world around him. Michael Jackson clung to the side of his brothers, his wide eyes darting from face to face as if searching for a safe place to land. He was 9, unbearably shy, too polite to interrupt, and too overwhelmed to hide how frightened he was of being seen. And then she appeared. Diana Ross did not simply enter a room, she altered its temperature. Every head turned as she walked forward, radiant, regal, already carrying the effortless command of someone born to be adored. She saw the timid boy with the trembling hands, and something in her softened. Without hesitation, she bent down, cupped his cheek lightly, and whispered a single word that would echo inside him for the rest of his life: "Sweetheart." In that moment, something invisible shifted. The boy who felt too small suddenly felt chosen, noticed, safe. Michael would later say he remembered every detail of that night: the color of her gown, the way her perfume wrapped around him like a protective halo, the warmth of her voice. For a child raised under a strict, often frightening father, affection seldom came without tension. But Diana's kindness was effortless. Her presence was nurturing in a way he had never known, and yet dazzling enough to awaken a dream he didn't know how to name. She wasn't simply a star. She became the idea of beauty, possibility, freedom, and the promise that he, too, could shine without fear. Motown executives saw talent. Michael saw salvation. From that night forward, he gravitated toward her with a mixture of adoration and awe, the kind that forms when a child imprints on the first person who gives him warmth in a cold room. Diana saw more than promise in him. She saw fragility, a gentle soul hiding behind impossible ambition. She invited the Jackson 5 into her home, introduced them to her world, and guided Michael through the intimidating corridors of the music industry with a tenderness that defied professional duty. The relationship was never defined. Not then, not ever. It wasn't maternal in the traditional sense, nor was it simply mentorship. It was something suspended between admiration and affection, a connection that felt destined yet unspoken. Whenever Diana entered a room, Michael's posture changed. His shoulders straightened, his eyes brightened, and a quiet longing shimmered beneath the surface. He studied her, the way she moved, the way she charmed an audience, how she balanced strength with softness. She became the blueprint for everything he wished to embody. And she felt his devotion, though she rarely acknowledged it out loud. There was a purity in their early bond, an innocence untouched by the complications that would eventually come. But even in those first encounters, anyone paying close attention could sense the beginning of something delicate and powerful, an emotional thread that would stretch across decades, shaping two lives that, from the outside, appeared to travel separately, yet were always quietly entwined. Michael didn't know it then, and neither did she. But that night in 1968 marked the beginning of a story neither of them would fully understand until much later. A story of admiration turning into affection, affection maturing into longing, and longing settling into a love that would never quite find a name. By the late 1970s, Michael Jackson's life had already begun to drift away from the childhood he once clung to. Success had come early, too early, carving out a strange loneliness beneath the applause. He was 20 now, still tender, still searching for a sense of belonging, but the world was growing louder around him, demanding more, expecting perfection. And through all the noise, one constant remained: Diana Ross. She had become the compass by which he navigated the chaos of fame. Every decision, every dream, every stirring of ambition somehow aligned itself with the gravitational pull she had on his life. So when The Wiz entered production, the film was not simply an opportunity. It was a chance to be near her in a way the industry rarely allowed. Michael wanted the role of the Scarecrow with a determination that startled even those who knew him best. Quincy Jones would later say that Michael lobbied harder for this than for anything else in his early career. But beneath the professional explanation, expanding his artistry, testing his acting abilities, there was a quieter truth, one that Michael never publicly admitted. He wanted to follow Diana wherever she went, even if it meant learning an entirely new craft. For him, The Wiz was less about acting and more about orbiting her light. When filming began, Michael was overwhelmed not by the cameras, but by proximity. Diana played Dorothy, radiant and commanding, the center of every room, and Michael, wrapped in burlap and straw, found himself studying her with the same reverence he once had as a child in Motown's crowded halls. Yet the context was different now. They were adults, colleagues, equals on the call sheet, sharing rehearsals, late-night conversations, and long drives between sets. The innocence of their early bond began to blend with something more complicated, something that frightened him with its intensity. On set, they were playful. She teased him about his shyness, and he laughed in that soft, breathy way that revealed far more than he intended. There were moments, small, fleeting moments, when Diana's hand lingered a little too long on his arm, or when their eyes met across the soundstage with a depth that neither dared to name. Michael, with his heart always too exposed, began to interpret these gestures as signs, as possibilities, as pieces of a story he wanted desperately to believe could happen. It was during this time that he invited her, quietly, nervously, to his private apartment more than once. Friends later recalled how he would ask anxiously if she had slept well, how he paced before seeing her, how he seemed transformed by her presence. Nothing scandalous happened. Michael was not the man tabloids tried to invent. What happened was more fragile, more intimate. Conversations that stretched into the early hours, shared meals shielded from paparazzi, and a sense of warmth Michael had never known in adulthood. In that small apartment, they were not icons, not Motown royalty, but simply two lonely souls who felt safer in each other's company than in the world outside. Diana sensed the shift in him. She felt his affection deepening, maturing, becoming something that hovered dangerously close to real love. And though she cared for him deeply, she began to do what she would always do, maintain just enough distance to keep him from crossing a line that frightened her. She was more than 20 years his senior, a woman navigating the brutal double standards of Hollywood. To reciprocate openly would invite judgment, misunderstanding, and damage he was far too gentle to survive. Still, Michael couldn't help it. Every day on the Wiz set carved her deeper into his heart. He embodied the scarecrow, innocent and yearning to learn how to think, while inwardly he was a young man trying to understand emotions he had never been taught how to hold. The film would later be mocked, dismissed as a failure, forgotten by critics. But to Michael, it became a private treasure, proof that for a brief moment in his 20s, he lived close to the woman who made the world feel safe. And when filming wrapped, when Dorothy clicked her heels and the lights dimmed, Michael quietly realized something he had never admitted aloud. He had fallen in love with Diana Ross, not as a boy idolizing a star, but as a man discovering what longing truly meant. By 1982, Michael Jackson had stepped into a new orbit. Thriller was taking shape, and the world had begun to whisper the word genius when they spoke of him. Yet for all the accolades collecting around his name, there remained one part of his life he could not outgrow, outrun, or silence: Diana Ross. She continued to exist at the center of his emotional universe, not through grand gestures or constant presence, but through the lingering imprint of every year they had walked side by side. She was the measure against which he quietly compared every woman he met, the voice he heard in moments of uncertainty, the figure who defined both his confidence and his vulnerability. The more famous he became, the more carefully he guarded his private heart. But fame has a way of cornering even the most cautious souls. When Ebony magazine scheduled a rare interview with him in 1982, Michael entered the room composed, masked, and determined to protect the one thing he never allowed the public to dissect. The conversation moved smoothly at first. Questions about music, inspirations, the growing pressure on his shoulders. Then the reporter, almost casually, asked him who he loved most in the world. Something in him faltered. For a moment, the cameras seemed to dissolve, the interview faded, and only a single truth rose to the surface, the truth he had been carrying for nearly 15 years. Before he could filter his thoughts, before the careful restraint returned, Michael breathed out the words that stunned everyone present. "It's Diana Ross. I love her." The room froze. Assistants stopped mid-step, the air tightened, and even Michael seemed startled by the sound of his own confession. He laughed a nervous laugh, trying to soften the moment, claiming he was only joking. But anyone watching closely could see the shift in his eyes, the flicker of panic, the brief collapse of the emotional dam he had spent years reinforcing. For once, the truth slipped out unguarded, and the world caught a glimpse of the man behind the legend. In the years that followed, Michael's affection for Diana began to seep into his art, creating a constellation of musical clues that fans and insiders would decode for decades. Dirty Diana, written during the period when Diana married Arne Ness Jr., was registered on the exact day she said "I do." Publicly, he insisted the song was about groupies. Privately, friends said he was devastated, disappearing for days with only Diana's photographs and a notebook filled with unfinished songs for company. He told one friend, in a rare moment of candor, "If I had been a few years older, she wouldn't have chosen someone else." Then came Remember the Time, a lush, cinematic ode to a powerful woman, written with such longing that even his brother Jermaine admitted Michael wrote that for Diana. The music video, drenched in gold and nostalgia, captured a man performing for his queen, trying to win her attention with the same aching devotion that had shaped him since childhood. He never admitted this publicly. He was afraid she would misunderstand, or worse, withdraw. Michael's love for Diana had matured, but it remained unreturned in the way he yearned for. Diana cared deeply, so deeply that she feared touching the boundary between affection and desire. She understood the weight of her influence over him. She understood the fragility beneath the brilliance. And so she kept a careful distance, a distance that both protected and tortured them. In private letters and whispered confessions, Michael tried to articulate the ache he carried. He wrote to her once, a letter never sent, where he ended with the words, "I wish things were different." He told Glenda, in a tape later leaked, "She's the love of my life. She has no idea what she means to me." It was a love he could not claim, could not bury, and could no longer hide. A love that would grow darker, deeper, and more consuming as the years unfolded. By the mid-1980s, Michael Jackson stood at the summit of global fame, a man whose every breath was recorded, analyzed, and sold to the world. Yet, with every stadium he filled and every accolade he collected, the distance between Michael and ordinary human connection grew wider. He once told a friend that fame was a room with the lights always on. And though the world saw him as untouchable, the truth was painfully simple. He was becoming lonelier than ever. And whenever the loneliness felt unbearable, his mind returned to the one person who had always made him feel grounded, understood, and safe, Diana Ross. It was during this period that the whispers began about a small room in his home, a room tucked just beyond his bedroom, hidden not out of shame but out of reverence. Those who entered it described curved ceilings, white brick walls, and an atmosphere that felt strangely sacred. It wasn't the theatrics that tabloids later invented. There were no rituals, no odd behaviors, only photographs of Diana Ross across the decades, arranged with a tenderness that revealed more than any confession he ever made publicly. Some images were professionally taken. Others were candid moments she never knew were captured. On shelves sat small mementos, ticket stubs, newspaper clippings, a scarf she once forgot in a dressing room, and even a few handwritten notes she had given him in the early 1970s. What tabloids mocked as a shrine was, in truth, the emotional archive of a man who didn't know how to let go of the person who had shaped his heart from childhood to adulthood. For Michael, this room was not a place of obsession, but a sanctuary for the feelings he struggled to contain in a world where vulnerability was devoured. Here, he could breathe without the pressure to perform, love without the fear of being misunderstood, and remember the rare moments when he felt whole. The Glenda tapes, recorded quietly in the early 1990s, offered the clearest window into his private pain. In a brittle, trembling voice, he admitted, "It was unrequited love. Our relationship existed mostly in my head." This wasn't an admission of delusion. It was a confession of a man who had spent decades loving someone he believed he could never have. It was honesty stripped of performance, a truth too fragile to share with the world, yet too heavy to hold alone. And through everything, through the storms of public scrutiny, the suffocating expectations, the betrayals, Diana remained a constant, even when they went months without speaking. When the first allegations against him exploded in 1993, the world sharpened its knives. But Diana did what almost no one else did. She called him. Not as Miss Ross, not as the icon he had idolized, but simply as the woman who understood his heart better than anyone. To Michael, that phone call meant more than headlines would ever reveal. It was a reminder that he had not imagined the bond between them. Those close to him later said that when he felt lost, he retreated to the room with her photographs, sitting silently for hours, sometimes humming melodies only she had ever heard. He kept one picture, an early Motown portrait of Diana, on the nightstand beside his bed for decades. It traveled with him from home to home, from triumph to tragedy, an unspoken anchor in the storm of his life. Diana never condemned any of this. She never mocked it, never dismissed it, because she understood exactly what it meant. She had always known the fragile emotional landscape inside Michael, knew how deeply he felt, how fiercely he loved, and how little he asked for in return. And though she could not give him the kind of love he longed for, she carried his devotion with a gentle respect, never turning it into spectacle or scandal. In the end, the room was not about Diana Ross. It was about Michael Jackson's longing, raw, quiet, and achingly human. A longing that revealed the loneliness behind the glitter, the private ache of a king who could conquer the world, but could not mend the one place inside him that remained forever tied to her. When Michael Jackson passed away in 2009, the world mourned a phenomenon. Tributes erupted across continents, crowds gathered outside hospitals, candlelight vigils spread like wildfire. The headlines spoke of loss, genius, controversy, spectacle. But on the inside, away from flashing cameras and endless speculation, unfolded a moment so intimate, so revealing, that it reshaped everything people thought they knew about Michael Jackson's heart. It happened during the reading of his will. Inside a private room, the Jackson family listened solemnly as Michael's estate attorney detailed the careful, meticulous arrangements he had made. Michael had always been cautious with legal matters, always aware of how fragile life could be for someone living in the center of the world's gaze. His children, Prince, Paris, and Blanket, were his greatest treasure, his final refuge from loneliness. And so, as his will was read, the family expected the usual. His mother, Catherine Jackson, named guardian, his siblings listed as secondary support, legal formalities meant to preserve order in the chaos grief would bring. But then came the surprise, one that drew immediate silence. If Catherine Jackson became unable or unwilling to care for Michael's children, there would be only one person entrusted with their future. Not Janet, not Rebby, not LaToya, not Elizabeth Taylor, the woman the public assumed held his deepest emotional trust. The name was Diana Ross. Those present said that Catherine herself paused, visibly stunned. Rebby covered her mouth. One of the brothers muttered a soft, "Wow," unable to hide the shock. And far away, in a separate place, chosen deliberately to avoid the media frenzy, Diana Ross was informed privately of the designation that would forever cement her place in Michael's life story. She wept. "This is too personal," she told a close friend later. That she had no idea, absolutely no idea, that Michael would trust her with something so sacred. "This is too personal," she whispered when reporters asked for comment. And for nearly a year, she refused to speak publicly, choosing silence over misinterpretation, grief over publicity. To the world, it was a legal footnote. To Diana, it was a final confession whispered from a man who never found the courage to make it out loud. The will revealed what Michael had never quite been able to articulate. She was his safe place, the person he believed would protect the most precious part of him even when he was gone. Not because she was a legend, not because she was Miss Ross, but because she was the only person whose presence had ever made him feel secure. Those close to Michael said this choice was not sudden. It was the culmination of decades of trust, devotion, and emotional imprinting. Diana was the beginning of his artistic identity, the first hand he reached for in fear, The first heart he fell in love with without understanding what love meant. In choosing her for his children, he wasn't choosing romance or fantasy. He was choosing family. The one connection that never fractured, never betrayed him, never became a weapon in the public eye. And what of Diana? In the quiet twilight of her life, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge the truth she had protected for so long. "Michael loved me," she said softly. "Loved me in a way that's hard to name." But the most revealing words were the ones that followed. "I cared for him deeply, more deeply than I knew how to explain. But I was always afraid that if I crossed the line, I might break him." It was a love caught forever between what was felt and what was feared. A bond shaped not by what they did, but by what they never dared to do. A bond immortalized not in a song, not in a photograph, but in a will, where a man entrusted a woman with the only future that mattered to him. In the end, the story of Michael Jackson and Diana Ross was never about scandal, nor was it the myth of forbidden romance whispered by tabloids hungry for spectacle. It was something quieter, more fragile, a current of emotion that ran beneath decades of fame, stitched together through glances, gestures, and the kind of loyalty that rarely survives the glare of the spotlight. Their connection refused to fit into a single definition because it lived between categories, part devotion, part admiration, part longing, part protection. It was, as Diana herself confessed, a bond not easy to name, held together by equal parts courage and fear. Michael carried that love like a hidden melody, letting it seep into his music, his choices, his silences. Diana carried it like a responsibility, shielding it from misunderstanding, maintaining enough distance to keep him safe while remaining close enough to remind him that he was never alone. Neither of them fully understood what to call it. Perhaps that was why it endured. Love that has no name cannot be broken by titles, timing, or circumstance. It simply continues, quiet and steady, until it becomes part of a person's very breath. When Michael left the world, he left behind stadiums, records, controversies, and unmatched brilliance. But what he reserved for Diana Ross was something far more delicate. A trust that transcended age and expectation. A choice carved into his final wishes, revealing a heart still tethered to the woman who had guided him from the shadows into the light. And now, in the softness of her later years, Diana looks back not with regret, but with a kind of tender sorrow, carrying the knowledge that some loves survive not because they are fulfilled, but because they are never spoken aloud. Their story remains suspended in the space between what was possible and what was protected. A love unnamed, but unforgettable. A bond untouched by time, preserved by silence. A connection that, in the end, belonged only to them.